and I'm going to read the weather forecast for
Oh,
everyone.
no.
Yeah.
Did you say 7 days?
It's okay. So today,
Mm-hmm.
100% chance of rain.
Yep.
Tomorrow.
That's what's happening.
Tomorrow, rain. Wednesday, rain. Thursday, rain. Friday, rain. Saturday, rain. I have a favorite temperature, but before we talk about
Yeah? Panicking over my favorite temperature notes. They're not here. I'm going to fire my assistant.
We don't have to talk about it. We don't. Who's your assistant?
No one, because they're fired.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Quest Markers. On this show, we talk about the intersection of video games and our disciplines in the gaming industry. My name is Marina. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a video game composer, vocalist, audio engineer, and your host. And today, I am so excited to have my friend Paul with us. Paul is now a Nebula-nominated writer and game designer who most recently worked on Pacific Drive, which I just finished playing and was delightful. As always, this episode will be timestamped with the topics we cover, so feel free to jump around if you're watching the VOD. And if you're here with us on Twitch, we do have emote-only chat, as you've noticed, for the duration of the recording, and we'll open it up at the end for some Q&A. I'm very keen for today's conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for spending your morning with me. And before I ask for your introduction, Paul, this has somehow become a ritual of the show, but how are you staying hydrated?
Yeah, I'm doing the same as you in the conversation that we just had, that so I'm actually much better at this than I used to be. Sounds really boring. I track what I eat and drink.
Mm-hmm.
I got into the habit of doing this a while ago when I returned to the gym and made the gym a habit. I will track or approximately track like what I eat and what I drink with an app that I have. And it's not really about monitoring exactly what I do. It's more just the habit of thinking about, well, I ate this today and I haven't eaten a certain thing for a while, or maybe I'm eating too much of this or not enough of this. And it's made me aware a little more of the calorie or the protein or the carb content of certain things that I eat. So it reminds me to mix up my food a bit, but I also track the amount of water that I put in my body. And it's also made me more aware of, like, when I have a glass of water, of like a glass of certain size is about quarter of a liter. It's about 250 mil. And then a different glass that I have will be a bit more than 400. And I almost always have like a glass of water in the morning, kind of straight away when I'm up now to do that. And I didn't do that this morning. I just had a cup of coffee and had my pastry. And the cup of coffee I made was really bad. So I'm now on the second. And I think it's because it wasn't strong enough, because I think I didn't measure it out well, because I've got into this thing of, I'll time how long it brews for, because I'll do a sort of pour over filter thing. So I know like roughly how much coffee goes into the thing, and I set a timer and it's like, yep, that's happened for 4 minutes. That's about ready. And the second cup of coffee I'm having now tastes better because I think I measured it correctly. But this is a very long, elaborate, it's that excuse thing where someone doesn't have a good answer for you, so they talk for a really long time. That's it.
No, I love it.
Yeah.
I also have coffee. So yeah, we're
that's in a glass.
It is. Well, it's cold. It is cold coffee without ice. And then I'm dual wielding with some water.
Oh, yep, you're doing that again.
Yeah. The water's in the background though, so I seldom reach for the water. I reach for the coffee, and yeah. It's just
it's worked. It has made me a bit better at drinking a certain amount of water, and I do make sure I get at the very least, I get a liter of just water a day. It's often like more, but regardless of like any other drinks or any other hydrating things that go in my body, it has made me more hydrated, which I think has actually made stuff better.
Yeah,
in my life.
There you go. I could talk about the fact that I also started tracking my food when I went vegan because I wasn't getting enough protein and was hungry all the time. But we should probably get into your introduction if you would like to introduce yourself.
I didn't actually prep for this. My name's Paul. My pronouns are he, him, and I am also in the games industry, as we know. Obviously, as you said, I kind of chiefly call myself a writer because that's what I most identify with. But I have done games design. I've done, I guess, narrative design. I've done a lot of journalism. I've done a bunch of like YouTube video stuff. I worked in a hardware store, which was actually really interesting for a while. I worked in a Safeway, which was less interesting. Yeah, that's really it. That's really all the things. I chiefly write in some way, and like having been a journalist for a while, that's writing related anyway. That does point you in certain more research focused directions. So that can be a certain kind of writing and involve certain disciplines that could be very different to like being a narrative designer. But that's been a fundamental element of what I've been doing since I was about like 3 or 4 years old, honestly, is it's just I would write for fun. I would write in other jobs. When I worked in, I worked at my university for a while after I graduated, and I ran a peer mentoring program, and did a lot of volunteer placement for students, and actually did a couple of things. And then anything that was writing related in that job, I was like, yeah, I'm going to write a report about this, or I'm going to write a training document, and I'm going to help other people do their jobs. And that just bled into everything that I've done in my whole life.
I love that. I want to congratulate you again on the Nebula Award nomination. Congratulations.
Thank you. That's really exciting. That
It's very
is,
exciting.
I mean, I've said this before and I'll keep saying it. It's kind of, it's something that I see as like very shared with a lot of people, because the thing with like the Nebula Awards are really big sci-fi thing, and like the first ever Nebula Award, I think winner, I was going to say nominee as well, but it would have to be, was Dune, was the book Dune in like the mid-60s by Frank Herbert. And I've been reading Nebula stuff, and I guess occasionally playing Nebula stuff now, because there's a games category for like most of my life. So that's kind of strange to be now in that pantheon of things, and still a bit kind of unreal. But like, I'd never be in that if we didn't have such a good narrative lead on the project, who was Carrie, who was my boss, who was fantastic when I joined the project. One of the first things that happened, I think, within the first week is she, as part of onboarding, she linked me to like different docs and some stuff that she'd been working on, and I think she was finalizing something with the script at the time. And I opened up this thing, and it was just a timeline, and it was the alternate history timeline of the Pacific Drive world compared to our real world. And how things had diverged, and dates where certain events had happened, and some background on some certain characters and people. And some of this is obvious in the game, and some of it is in the background. And I compare it to, it's like having a jigsaw where a few pieces are missing, and you don't have to actually assemble the jigsaw playing. You can just play the game, but a lot of the document stuff that you find, and all of this background and information that comes up, there might be a reference to something on the radio, or something in some written text, or something that comes out of the fax machine in the game. This isn't just like random nonsense. It all actually has a chronology of when certain things happened. And I've done a lot of tabletop RPG stuff in my time. I've played loads. I've written a few like tabletop RPG games and supplements, things like this. And that's some of my games experience. And it was a bit like when I was like 14 years old, and I would buy some new tabletop RPG source book and open it. It was like that. My first days on the job was like, it was like Carrie had written all of this stuff already. And I was like, oh, I get to play in this world, because I didn't have to do as much of the hard work of like, she was the person who sort of, cranks the engine and gets it going. And then you come on board and you're like, oh, this thing's already moving. It's so much easier to like move it along. So it's a very, very takes a village kind of thing. And honestly, everyone who worked on that game earned this nomination to some degree, because, when you've got great like systems designers and sound designers and level designers, everyone doing the art, even like the marketing, the engineering, literally every member of the team builds the world. And then so when people say like, oh, it's got a great narrative, that's in as much all of those different elements as it is anyone sat at a keyboard like writing stuff.
I feel that way as well. Everything is so interconnected with games. It's and we'll talk about, I think we spoke about talking about some team stuff later on, but yeah, everything is so interconnected in games. And I mean the I guess maybe very practical way of thinking about it is ultimately things need to be coded.
We
Everything
had
touches that.
absolutely, for a lot of the project, we just had 2 engineers, which was 2 guys who worked really
Wow.
hard called Scott and Zach, who the thing is, like, when you're showing off a game, like, at a convention, if you like at PAX and people are like, "Oh, this sound design is cool," or like, that, or, "I love the design of that weird entity, that weird anomaly," or like, "Oh, this bit of writing is funny," or like, "Oh, the way this system works is cool." Like, an engineer can't really point at any of that and say, "I did that." But the engineer is the person who literally stitched it all together, and gave you the tools to help you do your job. They're just, they're down in the mines with a pickaxe and they're covered in coal. And nobody gets to see them trying to make all this stuff work. And also the other thing is, like, I mean, I think we had Frankie join a bit later, and a guy called Brian as well, who I think counts as a engineer, but that was very much towards the end or later in the project. But these poor people have to also deal with this, like, messaging them at random times and being like, "Hey, I have no technical knowledge and I broke your toy, and could you help me?" It's the game's equivalent of someone going, "Dad." And I had to do that. And I think Scott at the time particularly was like 23 or something, and was like one of the smartest, honestly, like one of the most mature, collected people on the team. And I was just being like, "Hey, I don't know what I'm doing. Could you explain this to me?" Man born this century, and he'd very patiently be like, "Yeah, this is what you do, or this is why this is happening." And I'd be like, "Oh, thanks."
That's very kind.
But yeah,
I had a Oh,
no,
I'm sorry.
sorry,
Go
go
ahead.
on.
No. Please.
I was going to say, yeah, like, I couldn't do my job. I wouldn't have that Nebula nomination without Carrie, leading me, and all of those other people finding different ways to support me. So it's, yeah, I can't just walk around with this thing without, like, constantly singing the praises of all of these people.
Well deserved to the entire team. It was such a delight to play. And I told you this weekend when we caught up, I struggle with first person games from a depth perception standpoint. And
Yes.
so what was very meaningful to me was the amount of accessibility features, the sheer amount of things that you could toggle, from helping with motion sickness to damage modifiers to take less damage, which I fiddled with for myself because my car was taking a lot of damage
I
because of the
believe,
way I played.
I don't know if everything there came from Seth Rosen, the design director, but a lot did. I know there was a lot where Seth was like, "Hey, I want to put this feature in, or this idea," in terms of everything from, like, there's things in there for, like, "Oh, I want to turn off some elements of tumbling because I might be uncomfortable with that idea, or storms or things like that." And the great thing with a lot of stuff like that is you can just, if you don't care, you can ignore it. It's very, background. But if you particularly are like, "Oh yeah, I want to have this accessibility extra, this little thing would really help me." There's a lot in there, and I was very surprised. I actually learned this as a writer, because I had to. Some of my job as a writer is like coming up with exciting bits of text and adding to building the world and finding, writing cool collectibles. But also some of my job as a writer is just literally putting the menus together, helping put some of the UI together, and writing, explanatory text about what happens if you select a different anti-aliasing thing, which is not very exciting, but it was, I was responsible for all of the text in the game except for the subtitles, I think.
Wow.
At release. I think there's been some additions since where there's other text in there, but it's a lot of text. And you also have
It
in video
is.
games the localization process,
Yep.
which is got to export all the text and
Yeah.
send it to strangers, and so they can translate into a bunch of different languages, and then answer their questions when they write back, and, like, say, like, "In this sentence you said where, and do you mean, like, wear as in clothing, or wear down on fire?" And then you have to be like, "Okay, well, the context of this sentence is this and this and this." So some of the job is just also just being a technical. I don't know how to. Some of it is creative, some of it is sort of like technical and just nitty gritty. And once you have a game of that size, you have a lot of text in a lot of different places. So it's also kind of a bit like being an archivist or a librarian. And I worked in Engine the whole time. So I had Unreal 4 point something on my computer and Perforce or whatever the version control software was. So I wasn't just writing stuff and sending it off to somebody else. I was the guy having to dig into the game's files and put text in things. And later in localization, you're like, oh yeah, this bit of text in the game, it's not where you think it is. It's actually deeply embedded in some weirdly ambiguous asset over here. So let me just, I just remembered a story about this. I forgot that this happened, but what people would do, this was a joke originally, but what people would do is if they found text somewhere in the game that hadn't been either filled in or properly tagged for localization, they would just change the text to Paul Wright.
Hopefully all of those were caught. I mean, I didn't see anything that said Paul Wright as I played the game, but there were a couple of very Paul coded jokes that I was like, Paul definitely wrote these.
Right. You're supposed to find that. There was a localization person in China, God bless them, who wrote to us and said, excuse me, what is Paul Wright?
I mean, that is a fair question when their role is localization and that is within the text of the game.
It became an archaeological kind of weird thing because like maybe some bit of the HUD or the UI something, it pops up and you're like, where is this text?
Yeah.
And it could be in some asset that somebody made like right at the start of the game 2 years ago that doesn't have that, you know, doesn't link to other assets in the same way. Like it's literally coded differently. And so you dig deep into something and you're like, oh, well, this is here. So do I change it here or do I point it to a different asset, put it in a string table? Yeah, there's a weird element in there of just people don't always think of narrative and writing stuff at the start of a project. It's quite normal for people to not do that. And so you come in later and you're like, yeah, I'm just, you know, sort of stitching other bits together to make everything coherent. That's become my job.
And that's the thing that people don't see. And with music, I think similarly, I think people think, oh, you sit down and you write some music and then you export the music and everything else goes into some black hole. That is not the case. That is not the case.
I think there's so much in pipelines in what we do in our jobs where we try to make that the case, where we try to make it so that someone can come in, sit down, do a thing. But I think almost this is a thing that people don't always learn about any creative job is very rarely do you just do the thing in a linear fashion.
Yeah. Oh, like
you don't write a document and start at the start and write it all and you get to the end and you type the end and you're like, great, this is finished.
Yeah.
And with my limited experience as a musician, there's very few, like playing music live, being in bands, stuff like that. There's very few bits of music where you just start composing at the start and you finish composing at the end. I was in a studio, I think probably once ever to record an EP with a band I was with. And it was, honestly, it was like layered. It was like, yep, we're recording this now. Okay, well, that gets the rhythm section down. But actually now we need to punch in some vocals or we need to do an overdub here or...
Yep. I think we're kind of on this topic of maybe similar to what we were talking about this weekend of a lot of people don't see many aspects of game development. And a lot of people don't see what it means to practice one's craft. And for me, I've said for a while now that I think that inspiration is a muscle. Like it really... And this is, you know, people can agree or disagree, but to me, inspiration is a muscle. I'm inspired when I am very present in the world, and I'm inspired when I write more music. And it is easier for me to write more music when I'm already writing a lot of music than it is for me to write music when I haven't written music for a really long period of time and then getting back into it. And I think there's an element of momentum in there. But
yeah.
Regardless of like whether people agree or disagree, I'm curious what your like writing practices, habits, and techniques are. Because to your point, the writing isn't just, oh, we'll write the plot points and then we'll write the dialogue. Video game writing is so much more than that.
Gosh, there's two things there I feel like I want to touch on, because yes, there's process is one thing, and then what you do within video games, or also I think maybe all games, like tabletop games. I wanna, if it's okay by you, I'll start with thinking about more generally me as a writer and some of my writing process and what that's like outside of games, or irrespective of games. You're right that it's a muscle. The more regularly you do it, the better you get at it, but the better you get into the habit of doing it. I'm 45 years old, and so I've probably been writing in one way or another for about 41 years, because I discovered that writing was fun and I could make stuff up, and that I enjoyed that when I was like 4, 5, 6. That it was just a thing that you could do for fun and enjoy. And that, the tools that you need for writing are like a crayon and a piece of paper. Or it wasn't really writing, but if we go back to me being like a toddler, then it was a crayon on like the wall. I have vague memories of being like about 3 or 4 years old and being like, why is there crayon all over the hall in the house? And my mother being like, well, actually, you did that. Yeah, it's just a thing that I did that I have no memory of doing. But like, you do something a lot and you become pretty competent in it. And we actually do this in life with loads of things. We just maybe don't think about it. If we get into the habit of cooking all the time, then we become like, pretty solid cooks, even if it's not our job. Or if we do some amount of exercise, we become pretty solidly like good at a certain exercise, whether that might be walking or cycling or anything like that, or hiking. Habits are really good for us as human beings. And I accidentally made writing a habit because I enjoyed it. And that makes it easier for me to start from scratch, and look, I don't feel that bad when I look at a blank page most of the time. So there's that element of just, I made it a habit, and then I consciously made it more of a habit in my 20s by like trying to keep a journal, keep a diary, or regularly just writing, how can I say, just making myself write something every week. Just being like, well, have I written something about like current affairs or something that I care about? And I would try and just regularly do that. I got into my first paid professional writing stuff was games journalism when I was about 21. And my first ever published games journalism was in a magazine called PC Format, which doesn't exist anymore. But that came about because I would write stuff on the internet and share it on internet forums. And I'd write like a 400-word review of a video game, or write a short piece about how I felt about something. And eventually these just formed a portfolio. And I sent, for review, I sent a bunch of this stuff to a guy called Kieran Gillen, who's now a comics writer. But at the time he was the games editor on PC Gamer. And he just was like, I was like, what would you say I should improve? And he was like, I think this is good. This is better than some of the people we're hiring. And he passed it on to a guy called Adam Oxford, who had just moved to this PC Format magazine. And then that was it. Adam was like, hey, I think some of this is good. I'm going to hire you to write a thing. Once you got one piece published, suddenly I had these different editors in my inbox being like, hey, I saw your thing. Are you available to write this? Can you do this? Can you go on a press trip to Cambridge? And that was just because I made a habit of like writing things and sharing them on the internet for people's feedback. And that habit and that doing thing, you can't help but get better at something when you keep doing it. As for the writing for games process, I mean, I think it's narrative design in games is super strange, because I think we still... games are a really broad spectrum of different things, and the writing needs of something like Half-Life or Half-Life 2, which are games that did benefit from having people dedicated to narrative and world building, who are, deeply embedded with the team and talking about themes and level design and how to structure stuff and how to do environmental narrative. And not just what characters say, but like what stuff looks like and how the environment responds to a player. The writing needs of that are really different to the writing needs of like a big RPG like Baldur's Gate or Pillars of Eternity, where you might have lots of branching dialogue and lots of flags and lots of maybe gating the player at a certain point. So they're restricted to a certain part of the world till they do a certain thing. Then the world and the plot opens up. But then you have to track lots of variables where it's like this person won't say this thing until this character dies or until this quest is complete, or this person reacts differently if you have this object in your inventory, or if you have a certain amount of money, or if your character is evil. That's just a different kind of narrative design need. And I think the reality is that there isn't really one type of narrative designer, probably, or one type of writer. Same for like, if you're good at being a screenwriter, you might not be good at being a novelist, or vice versa. And I don't feel, honestly, as good at talking about process there, because I know what I've done when I've written for a couple of games and tabletop RPGs, but like I have peers in the industry who I admire whose jobs are completely different to mine, which is wild to think about.
Yeah, because writing isn't just one thing. And to your point about Baldur's Gate, when I was playing the game, I was so fascinated by how they must have produced that, the level of production need and the level for like lore producers and like almost like a DM for lore, like a lore master. Surely there has to be, at that scale, I can only imagine the amount of production that was required to make sure that Shadowheart says this under this, and this condition, and for someone to know what that is.
I think there must be an incredible amount of iteration that goes into that, and a lot of testing. If you look at the list of Nebula nominees on the internet, like they won for games writing last year, and I believe they just listed their whole writing staff, and it's a lot of writers. It's quite a lot of people, because there's a lot of dialogue in that game. There's a lot of things that happen. And I imagine there is an awful lot of testing and iteration and having to, be prepared for so many different things happening. And there's no way you can't really rush or cheat that. You have to play that and go through it. And I mean, it's a different thing with Pacific Drive, but across being on that project for like a year and a half or more, you reach a certain stage of the project and someone on the QA team is messaging you and saying, hey, this thing that you wrote now completely contradicts this other thing that you wrote 14 months ago. And you're like, oh yeah, it does, because I wrote that 14 months ago when I was thinking about something, and the scope of the game was different, and the game functioned slightly different, and I got to go back and change that now. And you have things like, as I say, a localization process, which is often a deadline where it's like, send everything off to be translated. That's hopefully all your work is done and like locked in, because you don't want to be repeatedly retranslating loads and loads of stuff because you had to iterate it because it conflicts with other text, or it conflicts with the way the game behaves, or you're describing the behavior of something or the appearance of something that changed. Somebody had to change an art asset or an audio asset, or a systems designer has changed how something worked. I've told this story before, but we had at one point text description of just a fuel can, which I think described it as, did it describe it as being plastic? And then the designer doing like resources and materials had made it so that you have to collect plastic to make this object. And I think the art asset came back as something that was obviously metal. And those kind of things happen. It's, you got a team of a lot of people doing a lot of different things. If you do it all perfectly first time, that's amazing. But I imagine a lot of Baldur's Gate 3 was an awful lot of people saying like, oh, I just added this thing and it broke everything. And everyone else being like, that's okay, that's normal.
Yeah.
Oh, probably.
Yeah, well, I think so much of it is having the right processes in place to catch things when there is something like that happens, that inevitably happens. Like their perfect game development does not exist at all. We are in technical debt from day one.
Yes.
Sherveen on the last episode, who runs his own studio, mentioned when they were making, I forget what part of the game, but they misspelled player as Plager instead of Playyer. And for the rest of development, that variable had to be called play. How would you pronounce that?
Plager.
Yeah.
Plager.
Yeah. And that's what it was for the rest of the game.
Yeah. That is, I think that's, the technical debt thing. You end up in, it's so difficult to do, but whatever you're building, and I think this is probably true for a lot of systems in the world, is once you have built a core that you start to build around and you build outward, new people come in later and they're like, why are we doing things this way? And it's like, we're just locked into this particular, it's like the shape of how you lay out a city. It is urban architecture. It's anything sort of really complex. You can come into it many years later and look at it and go, well, this is inefficient, but the needs or the accident or the technology that you had some time ago, it just, unfortunately, it points you in a certain direction. There's that thing that goes around about how do you solve back problems in human beings? And the answer is like, just don't evolve from quadruped creatures. Because if mammals hadn't started as quadrupeds, they wouldn't have later life back problems as bipeds. Because we haven't evolved enough to get used to being bipeds yet.
Yeah.
We're still used to the fact that our bodies sort of evolved from distributing weight differently. Or maybe, I don't know, being in water as, mammals a long time. But, evolution is a not entirely planned thing. It's just response to like your environment and things changing and like, oh, this doesn't quite fit anymore. Well, what can you do?
Yeah.
Definitely. I don't know where that answer went. That went in
many directions. It was a good analogy. That was a really good analogy. And before I might take us deeper down this road of working in teams, but I wanted to say hi to everyone who has joined as well, and that we'll open up chat at the end. But we've kind of been talking about games are complex. Typically, unless you're a true solo dev and you do absolutely everything yourself, making games is a team effort and a group project. And with that in mind, what maybe best practices have you learned and picked up along the way for working in a team?
It's funny. There's a few things I can think of, but I don't know why this came into my head first of all. But don't be sensitive.
Ooh, that's
and
a really.
The reason I think of this is like Pacific Drive. A lot of Pacific Drive, there were just 2 people in the QA team. So they had to do, and QA are not just people like finding bugs. They are people finding bugs because they found thousands of bugs, but they're also people running test cases. They're testing specific things and combinations of things and additions, which is like detailed, laborious work where you have to be good at your job and be very thorough. And there are people constantly saying like, also using their instinct and their sort of artistic creative vibe and saying like, hey, this kind of feels maybe a bit wrong, or I'm not sure about the tuning of this, and that means QA people get back to you and they're like, hey, you made a mistake here, or I don't think this thing fits in, or just giving you some feedback on this addition you've made. But also like your boss will be saying to you like, I don't think this is good enough, or I think you should change this, or we're going to have to cut this thing that you spent months on. Or like, we can't include all of the things that you want to do. We can include like 8 out of 10 of them. And you're like, what? But I worked really hard on all 10 of these and we cut it down from 11. And it's like, yep, sorry, that's what's going to happen. And it's not personal. And I guess through a fairly long career at this point of doing different creative things, this goes back to, again, when you're a journalist and you put something in a magazine and they're like, we want you to do this feature. It's going to be 2 pages. It's 800 words and we need a box out and we need something. That might go through a production editor and a section editor and the editor of the magazine, and they might change things. Or they might have to cut something down that you do. And they're trying to make your work look better and make it serve a purpose. They're not your enemy, but there are so many people who work in any creative field who work with a more competitive mindset, or treat things like they're kind of a zero-sum game. and people who are like very easily offended if you say to them like, hey, I don't think this is good, or we got to change this, or we can't afford this, or we got to do this in some kind of different way. And you cannot have a good working relationship with, like, if you're walking on eggshells with people all the time, or you're taking stuff personally when a colleague gives you, there's that old adage of true communication is only possible between equals, people you feel like really comfortable with, or people you feel, I guess, people you trust. And you have to be able to trust that someone else isn't trying to sabotage you or bring you down, or also that someone is not going to react poorly to you if you give them feedback that you hope is going to be constructive and help them do their job. It doesn't mean that like you have to be rude to people or say like, hey, this thing you did sucks, but you can say like, hey, we have a different need here, or like, this doesn't seem to work, or hey, we have to talk about this thing. And like I did this during the pandemic, actually. I worked on a whole bunch of tabletop RPG stuff, and I worked on a tabletop RPG called Magical Kitties Save the Day, which is this family particularly pointed at like younger girls to get more younger girls into tabletop RPGs. But it's a very family-friendly thing about like, playing cats with magical powers. And I had to do an entire source book for it, and some stuff that's in the main book. But when I got my first draft back, there was loads of corrections and there was loads of feedback from the editor, the person running the project. And when I first opened that text document, and this is like many tens of thousands, I wrote a lot. There was loads of stuff in there where she was like, you've repeated yourself here, or, you don't need to write this again. We can just put a page reference in, or like this bit, I don't think this is very interesting. I think you should build up on this bit. And I remember opening that, and like, I was probably like about 40. And I was like really despondent, and I was like, oh, I've really screwed up. And that's actually a really bad attitude for like a 40-year-old man in a creative job. I should have had a bit more of a leathery skin, because when I opened it again the next day and read her feedback, it was just constructive. It was just her saying like, this thing's really good, you should build this out. And when she was like, you've repeated yourself, she was right. I'd repeated myself too much. Or she was less interested in a certain thing that I did because someone else had done something like that on the project. So let's let them build that out, and we can like refer to their thing, and then I'll build out my thing that I came up with more that she's jazzed about. And, I did, over a couple of weeks, I did those corrections and revisions and sent them back. And she was like, yeah, this is better. Can you build on this more? We're changing this bit. And it was just her doing her job as an editor to make the work look better. We got an Emmy Award nomination for that, which is a big role-playing award. And that's, an editor at the head of a team making everyone do their best work. It's not about like, oh, Paul's a bit offended because like somebody said, hey, this isn't so good, you should get rid of this. That's kind of a crummy attitude to it. But as we get older, and I'm sure you've seen this too, like sometimes you work with people who are just, it's very much about them, and they're not going to give as much credit to the team when they get an award or a nod or something like that, and they're not interested in how other people in the process do their jobs. And unfortunately, some of those people fail upwards, and it's why some of us get burned out and sad and disappointed. So, I mean, there's lots of different bits of advice, but actually the first thing that comes to mind is like, it's not just about you, and the attitude that you bring and the way you talk to people makes a huge difference. People are going to talk to you so much more if they like working with you. And you're going to do a much better job together if, you'd have to, again, like DM your colleague or jump on a call with your colleague, and they're like, a little happy to talk to you, or they like your presence there. It's totally a different thing. We have a funny thing in the games industry, because the nature of what we do means some people have better soft skills than others. And some people get into tech things by themselves and spend their time at home in front of a computer developing stuff. And this is probably why I am the way I am. I spent a lot of time writing myself alone, and doing I read loads as a kid. And so, I got a really good vocabulary and a really good imagination, but I'm still not always the most articulate at describing ideas to somebody else. And sometimes I have to show something. Sometimes I have to describe something more than once. Sometimes I talk to a friend about something that I think is a great idea, and they're like, how does this thing work, this element of it? And I'm like, well, it's obvious. And they're like, no, it's not. Yeah, it's, I don't know, that's the very first process thing that comes to mind.
I think everything that you're talking about, I have such a vivid recollection of a team that I worked on.
Ooh.
Where it changed my brain chemistry for the better. But before I get into that story, I think it's natural for us to I wonder how much this will resonate, but I think it's natural for us when we get feedback to wince a little bit and to be sensitive. And I wonder how much of that is, at least in the Canadian schooling system, typically if you did well, you had no feedback on your essay. But if you didn't do well, it was riddled with comments. And I wonder how much of that we bring with us into adulthood and later stages of our life. But I learned, this was many years ago now, I was working with one of the best teams I've ever worked with. And there was this inherent understanding between everybody and it was two things. The first one was communication is kindness, clarity is kindness. And we have to make generous assumptions about each other. And but it was so embedded in the DNA of the team that it completely changed my brain chemistry and how I thought about feedback, because ultimately it was about, hey, you want to be here and you're here. How do we get you from just a personal professional development standpoint? How do we get you there? But it really, really did change my brain chemistry and how people communicated, and a lot of the conversations that were happening in that team were available to the rest of the team. Like you could just go into Slack and as you're searching for information, you would see these conversations. And I think that level of vulnerability to like work that publicly within a team, but also visibility kind of changed how I thought about feedback. And it really became, hey, we're here to do something together as a team. And it's not that anyone's picking on me personally for something that I may or may not have done. It's, hey, for us to achieve this thing, this North Star that we're walking towards, here's the things maybe that we could change. And we spoke about this over the weekend, but with music, I love getting very specific feedback. So I love when feedback is like, hey, from 0 to 20 seconds, everything's great. From 20 seconds to 25 seconds, not so sure about this. I think it's this instrument that I'm not so sure about, but I don't know, what it might be. Let's talk about it. And then from 25 to 35, that's great. Like that is very, very specific feedback. And I love that because it's actionable. I think good feedback is actionable, as opposed to someone just saying, hey, I don't really like this. And then it's like, okay, but that's a little bit difficult to action. But when someone says, hey, from this bit, this particular instrument, I think it's this about it that maybe we should change. I love. It's actionable. We're moving in the direction we want to be moving in, which is making sure that ultimately the player enjoys the experience. But again, I from that team I worked with years ago, I've brought this mentality of make generous assumptions about people. Like we're all here to make the best thing that we can possibly make. And we have the privilege to be doing something that is so cool, to be a part of making experiences for people that could really resonate with people, that could be life-changing, that could provide respite, that, et cetera, et cetera. Games can be a lot of things. And so I really agree with that sentiment of, I'm not very precious, I say about the music that I write for projects, because I have my own, independent artist stuff that I make for me. But the stuff that I work on in games is very much in service to the player. And if someone can help me be in more service to the player, then, all the better, I think.
I think that's such a good point, or such good points. Like the adage of assume good intent is more constructive. And it's usually what's happening most of the time. If somebody bothers to take part in something, it's often because they're trying to contribute to it in a constructive way. And I think we how can I say this? Like, I think we forget this sometimes, but that's the motivation behind a lot of people doing a lot of things that they do generally in their jobs or in their lives, is they're trying to accomplish something that's in some way like constructive or useful. And so, yeah, I think that assume good intent thing is really, really good. I also like what you said about specific feedback. And I don't know, looping around to, I didn't grow up in the Canadian education system. It's probably similar in some ways in the UK, but there is something about better specific feedback. I've been lucky in my life that sometimes I've written things that have been incredibly popular and like shared around an awful lot, and a couple of pieces of work I've done have gone viral over the years and, you know, been read by an awful lot of people. And I still get people, the Stardew Valley thing that I wrote 8 years ago now, I still get people reading that and responding to that.
I mean, it's an excellent piece.
Thanks very much.
It's so good.
Feel good about it. But the valuable, the stuff that connects most personally with me is when it's lovely when someone says, "Hey, I read that thing, it's great." But like when a guy met me at a convention in 2018 and was like, "I really related to this, and like these things in my life were like the stuff that you described, and I'm now in this situation," that was way more emotional because it's way more specific and way more of a feeling that you connected. It shows when you get specific feedback, it's people noticing what you've done, and engaging with it a lot more than just appreciating it or not. And you, speaking of music, you kind of reminded me of when I was working on Maya, the British indie game that I worked on in like 2012, 2014, that kind of era. I remember this wasn't something I was specifically doing, but I believe Nick, our sound designer and composer, was like putting together a track for a trailer and talking to Simon, who was the head of the project. And like, you know, I'm in the same chat, so I'm seeing the disc. And Simon was like, "Oh, I like this thing. I like what you've done here. But for this, like, I think you should remove the ghost notes on this percussion thing." And I was like, "Oh, Simon knows about music." That it suddenly hit me that you don't know what a ghost note is unless you probably do like some kind of proper, unless you're in music. And that bit of specific feedback, I think, was so much more useful to Nick. It wasn't just like, "Oh, I like this track," or "I don't like it," or it's like it's not funky enough, or it's, you know, the dynamics are weird. It was like Simon specifically said, "I noticed this thing, and I don't know if it quite works here." And immediately Nick's like, "Yeah, I know what to do about that because it's specific feedback." Yeah, you remind me of that, and that's such a valuable thing to have happen.
Yeah, it changed my brain chemistry completely. I'd like to switch gears a little bit, if that's okay. We've spoken a little bit about curiosity and following our curiosity, and you following your curiosity from a young age. I did the same. Like I was tinkering with like a cheap secondhand, you know, mixing console hardware when I was like 13. Inevitably, many years later, you know, found myself doing audio engineering. But some of my favorite life advice is follow your curiosity. And it's what led me down the path that I'm currently on. And again, specifically for me on the engineering side, which I never really thought that I would get into music engineering. I was always very intimidated by it. And now, having done it for many years, I'm like, I can't imagine not having this be a part of even my writing process when I make music. But I'd love to learn about what does curiosity and maybe being proactive about curiosity mean to you? It's a very, very broad philosophical question. I apologize.
No, but it's good. I want to ask you first, like, what was the first instrument that you learned?
Violin.
And how old were you?
11, I think.
So like fairly young, and you actually start with not the easiest instrument either. Like let's pick an instrument that's
that violin, yeah.
physically weird. There are no frets on a violin, so you got to learn. It's one of those instruments I think you probably do more by ear than for some other instruments. Guitar tab is such that you have like literally a map of where to put your fingers, which you know, pianos weird because I assume most people still learn by reading sheet music if they learn that way. But guitar, they give you like an actual map with, this guitar tab code that's just numbers and long lines, and it's I think one of the simplest, most sensible ways to translate how you interface with an instrument. But I asked that question because I don't know the answer to that question. I think that's interesting, and I think that says something a bit about you and about your own journey. And to loop it back to curiosity, like I got lucky that I learned to read really, really young. There's a picture of me like that my family had when I was about 3 years old, like reading TV listings or something. And I remember like I would read lots of things around the house. We had a bookcase that had not loads of books, but it had some books because my parents had a Reader's Digest subscription for a while, and like all kinds of random books would turn up. And I would just read history or sort of for the time contemporary stuff, but I would just like read magazines or I'd read the newspaper, and not the best newspapers, but we had like kind of crappy tabloids in my house when I was a kid. And that's all like easily digestible things. So you open up the TV listings and they're all like short summaries of like, this is what's on TV. This is what this program's about. And I'd be like, oh, what's this? What's that about? Why is this the way it is? When does that happen? And that's one of the annoying traits that I now have as an adult is I usually am interested. I'm interested in a lot of different things and why they are the way they are or how things happen. I'm curious, like we talked about the other day, I'm curious about how things get made and what people's processes are. And like, it's cool seeing like, how did this movie get made? Did it begin in this fashion? I've always had a kind of a both theater and film interest. And that's made me curious about how different actors and directors work and how did you turn this thing into a piece of work, and what was your process? What were your rehearsals like? Why did you cast this person? I studied philosophy at university, which for me was not like about asking weird questions or just dumb questions about like, strange thought experiments. It was much more like, why has the world developed the way it is? I was looking at the history of art. I was looking at the history of science. I was looking at why the world developed the way that it did and why we got into the habits that we did. That was all the stuff that I got out of a philosophy degree. And that led me more into art, and it led me more into feminism, and it led me more into the weird history of, when you study history of science, there is so much in there where someone discovers something and everyone else is like, shut up, don't do that. You have like Galileo being like, oh, it turns out the universe isn't the way that we think. And the Pope's like, okay, you have to go to prison now. And Galileo, I can't remember what it is in Latin, but he said, and yet it moves. He's like, look at the data. This thing moves. The universe doesn't work the way that we think. Or the guy who, I can't remember his name, but the guy who discovered that if you wash your hands between attending patients in hospitals, you communicate less disease. And he made a bunch of noise about this, and everyone was like, yeah, don't do that. This guy's a problem. And all of this inspired me to just be very curious and think about the way the world works and the way people react to stuff. And it made me a better journalist, and it made me a better writer, and it made me hopefully proactive about learning things and taking different things on and wanting to investigate stuff that isn't to do with me. The last film that I watched, which lots of people have been talking about again recently, was The Fabelmans, because it's David Lynch's last film. It's a Steven Spielberg memoir, and there's a David Lynch cameo. It was the last thing I think he did professionally before he died. But it's a short thing of him telling the kid, like, if you want to learn about movies, you also have to study art and be aware of it's about more than just movies. Writing isn't really about writing. It's actually about how you think about the world, and it's about what you care about. And you can't be inspired by yourself. You can't be inspired by nothing. You have to draw on other things around you. And you have to be, I think all artists are doing this all the time. I'm sure it's what musicians are doing. And I'm sure it's why, like, all the musicians that I loved when I was growing up, I still like now, would all, cover each other's songs and be influenced by one another. and take stuff from one another's work. And like, I'm still discovering this now as I get older and older, that like so much history of music is just people stealing stuff and borrowing stuff and being inspired by stuff. And there aren't really any genres. Everything bleeds together. What was it? I came across some old Shirley Bassey song the other day, which is just the Shirley Bassey song that Public Enemy sampled for when they did Harder Than You Think. And it was like, oh, hold on, I forgot. Of course, this is a whole thing. There's loads of 80s and 90s hip hop that samples some surprisingly edgy 70s stuff. But the stuff wasn't like as mainstream at the time, or considered maybe as good or as relevant, because sometimes it's just by black artists who weren't fronted as much. But being like, oh, all this stuff is just bleeding together the same way rock has bled together. And I think you have to do that in any creative job. You have to be curious, and you get your ideas from all kinds of places. You get your ideas from the news and politics and people around you and other people's stories. And so, even game development and being a narrative designer, I pulled from all kinds of different inspirations and things that I'd encountered in my life. And part of my job on Pacific Drive was I just researched stuff. I was terrified of the game coming out and someone finding something in the game and being like, clearly the writer didn't know anything about that. Clearly the writer, like, they got their history of the Pacific Northwest wrong. And there are nods to other different things that were really happening in the Pacific Northwest in that time with real people. But all of that all of that is researched and has genuine like passion in it. And it all comes from some part of curiosity that I had about something where I cared and I wanted to include something. And then I was like, oh, if I include this, the research has to be correct.
Yeah, that makes
all of which is a very long answer to like, it's all connected and I can't summarize it. I'm sorry.
No, I fully agree. I mean, I guess going back to like starting to learn violin, it was almost this this very lucky moment in that it was being offered at my middle school, right? And so it was like, hey, you want to go learn an instrument? You can go learn an instrument. And so it was just my natural, curiosity to go and do that. And being where I am today, like I think every single step has been fueled by some level of curiosity. But even when I think about, if I sit down to, let's say, mix a song, sure, I have templates and whatever that I have used in the past. And a lot of the times I don't want to use them because I'm so curious about fiddling with a particular sound to see how it might sound. And that's probably, every video on YouTube will tell you, you have to have your templates and it'll make things faster for you. And I'm like, but I'm curious about what if we did this different thing with this sound. And I stay curious, and I'm terrified of losing that curiosity, because to your point, like, curiosity about the world is also, on a macro level and on a micro level, is fascinating to me. And then that's inspiration for the next whatever it might be that I work on.
I mean, do you find it's like a kind of a restlessness, like you have to try something different, or you wonder how somebody else did a certain thing and then you're like, oh, I wonder if I can incorporate that?
For me, I really enjoy first principle tinkering, like not seeing what other people have done, unless I really need something very specific where it's like, oh yeah, I know that like this song did this very particular thing, and I wonder how they mixed it. I have a lot of curiosity on the engineering side, particularly. And so, yeah, sometimes I'm like, oh, this particular song did this particular way. Let me go down the rabbit hole of who was the mix engineer and how did they do it and why did they do it that way. But a lot of it is just me being curious about sounds and just putting on, a particular tool on a violin or a guitar or whatever to see what it might sound like. And maybe that's why it takes me, on average, I would assume, probably a little bit longer to mix something, because I lean into that curiosity. I'm like, oh, but can we find something cool in here? And I worked on a song that came out recently for video essayist who I'll link it in the comments, Monty Zander, who does incredible video essays on YouTube about games. And I had the privilege of working with him on a musical tribute to Resident Evil 1, which is the game that got me into horror, which I love that game so much. And as we were in the writing process for this song, and he wrote the lyrics, and I loved them, but I was so curious about like what other like random ear candy can we put in here? And so there's one lyric that says that talks about celebrations and celebrating horrific experiments that happen in Resident Evil 1. But what I did was I'm like, oh, celebration, right? Celebration. I had my coffee and my water, and I did one of these, and I just recorded just that.
Yeah.
And then I got really curious about that sound, what it might sound like. And I spent like way too much time on figuring out like, does this belong? If so, how? And ended up with like including that sound, and it pans from center to left, and it gives this really cool effect. Like, how can we make this a little bit more interesting? And leaning into that creativity. I don't know where I was going with this, but curiosity fuels everything for me. It fuels like how I think about composing. It fuels how I think about engineering. It fuels how I think about what influences are we bringing into a particular piece and why. I'm very curious specifically for game music about what is the player going to feel. And I think empathy is so important. I mean, like that's a full sentence. Empathy is important, but empathy is really important for musicians working on games because the music has to work for the player ultimately. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about what would the player feel if the music went in this direction, or what would the player feel if the music started looping here? Would they think that it was too short? Or what would the player feel if there was a crescendo here? Would it be too intense, or would it give them a sense of excitement? And so it's a lot of just asking questions. It's a lot of asking, well, what if?
Yeah.
Like as we're writing.
And is that fun for you though as well?
Like
it doesn't feel like a chore, does it?
No.
It feels like, oh, hey, I want to experiment with this, literally this noise of these objects.
Yeah, absolutely.
Composing and sound design are two of the things in games, or generally I think maybe even in film, that I still feel like the most interested by, partly, because of my different musical aspirations and enjoyment of music and seeing other people like do really good jobs with that. But there are so many people I've known who've done sound design and composition who are like really playful people. I remember an old friend of mine, I think doing something, with Bungie years back, where there was some huge industrial building in the Pacific Northwest that had been abandoned for a while, and they took their sound design team out there and just used the acoustics of this place to experiment with for certain sound design. And Bungie had a budget such that they could do that they could just drive a team out to a place and do this. But he talked about like how much fun it was. He wasn't just like, it's not like I'm doing a job now, oh god, someone's found an abandoned building, now I have to go to an abandoned building and do this thing. It's like it was interesting to him to see what would happen and to play around with that. And I think that's part of the curiosity thing, is like we're not doing these things out of obligation, are we? We're doing them because they like interest us and we enjoy doing that. I enjoyed like a lot of the research that I did for Pacific Drive and discovering a bit more about the history of the Pacific Northwest and certain things, even though not everything made it into the game. And then the challenge of like, what can we add? What is there time to include? All of these different things, because it was, I don't know, it was challenging. It was interesting. I discovered stuff and I tried to think of different ways to drop this in that affects the player, that makes them also maybe curious or interested, or like hopefully if some of the text is funny or inspiring, or like is a little bit of a larger story, it might make someone more curious to go and find something else somewhere else, or it might inspire someone to think more about where they live or think about the history of a place. I remember like running around in Horizon Zero Dawn, and there's little bits of like narrative collectibles in that world, and you don't have to find them. You don't actually need to pick up every like bit of side quest knowledge, but I just happened to enjoy them, and it made me want to run somewhere else and pick up the next 30-second or 1-minute audio log, or like 2 paragraphs of text about something, because they were good and they were interesting. And a lot of them are not about the main game, but they build out the world. And I don't know, in a player context, I became curious, and that was fun. And that's a little bit of an inspiration for that kind of thing too.
Yeah, I love that. I maybe final anecdote to put a bow on this little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'm thinking about the like clinking glasses. I could have easily gone and like licensed a sample for that, but I instead spent, an hour, quick recording, but I spent like an hour being like, how would this fit in the mix? And like, what does this recording sound like raw, not processed at all? And how does one get it to sound processed and professional? Yeah, so I think it's that level of curiosity that drives one.
I mean, that was fun, right? That wasn't, you didn't, again,
absolutely.
that didn't feel like a chore.
Yeah.
And now you know that, and you could apply that again somewhere else in a different way.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really good like mindset to have. And I don't know, maybe it's some kind of a personality trait, or it just lends itself to all kinds of things. I remember a really big key moment that Seth has talked about on Pacific Drive as the design director. There was one, I don't really know how long it took him, but there was a period over a weekend where he rejigged all the tools in the game so that rather than each tool doing one thing, tools could have multiple effects on multiple things in the game, which really added to the sort of the dynamism and the reality and the field of the world so much more. And you can try and prize, like you can cut up part of a car, or you can now try and like beat up part of a car with the crowbar, with the prize tool. And it's not going to work as well, but you could. And as Pacific Drive grew, it got like more elements of interactivity and more combinations of things happening. And I don't think that would have happened if there must have been, I'm sure, like I remember Seth showing me some of this stuff late at night on a call. And like, I'm sure I remember him like enjoying it and being like, hey, look at this, isn't this cool? Like, it wasn't just like, I feel like I have to do this. It's like, I feel inspired to do this because it'll make a fun experience. And that to me is like such a core experience of a lot of what is in that game. Is there's so many different surprising combinations of things that are hopefully as fun for the player, and hopefully they inspire the player to be a bit curious as well, because the player's occasionally like, oh, what if I do this with this? And something comes out of it. What if I drive over here? What if I try this object? And then, what if I, hopefully from the narrative writing kind of direction, people are like, oh, what if I scan this? What if I read this bit of text? What if I collect this log? What does that tell me?
Yeah. It was very obvious in the game that like the game rewards curiosity.
I hope so.
It really, really did. There were many times where I was like, oh, I'm going to go like upgrade my, I don't know, go get a schematic for a wheel, a new wheel. I had, by the way, my car was like armored by the end of the game. Oh, indestructible. Okay. I played like a goblin. I'm so sorry. Complete chaos goblin, off-roading all the time. But as I was upgrading my schematics, there were points where it was like, you haven't scanned this anomaly. You have to go and scan it. And you're very, very much rewarded for that. And so I think it feels like curiosity was really embedded in.
That's a lot of that's the design team. And that leads to the world building. Or that's still like kind of part of the narrative experience. But narrative in games is weird because everyone contributes in different ways. And a lot of the decisions the design team made, which was a bunch of people really, build out that sense of the world and that sense of place. And weirdly, like, it's not fair, but as a writer, sometimes you'd end up taking credit for what is actually 3 different people's contribution. It's an artist and a designer, and the engineer underneath everything as well, or like a sound design element, and people are like, oh, this is so spooky and atmospheric, and you're like, yeah, I'm about 20% of that spooky and atmospheric moment, but actually it's all the disciplines coming together.
Yeah, we seldom work alone.
Yeah.
Seldom work alone. I'm just keeping an eye on time. I feel like we have time for like one more maybe question, and then we can open it up for chat.
I have
if
loads
that
of
works.
time, so
I have a meeting in 50 minutes. Was there anything that we hadn't talked about that you wanted to talk about?
Well, we touched on this a bit.
We had prepped a fair bit.
We prepped a fair bit, and we ended up talking about this when we had coffee the other day. But
well, milkshakes and matcha, coffee, yeah, but milkshakes and matcha.
I've never had a mango milkshake before. Actually, that was kind of good.
It's really good.
We touched a bit on process. We touched a bit on this, I guess, at the start of the interview. But yeah, if I am just allowed to mouth off even more,
please.
I think a really good thing for people to think about all the time is that a creative process isn't linear, and there's no one way to do something or do a job. Like as a writer, definitely, like I said earlier, people sometimes have the illusion that you start a story like at the start and you write, on a dark and stormy night, something. You write through it and you get to the end. And really, what's more likely is you edit the story, you move things around, you cut things out, you write a draft and it's not very good. But that doesn't matter because that's not what you're going to submit. You're going to read the draft and you're going to look at the pacing and be like, this part is dull, or like, I need to change this out, or no one knows, but I will move the middle to the start, or nobody knows, but I started this story in the middle because I wanted to write about these cool characters and this cool moment. And then later I wrote the start of how we got there. And then later I worked out a conclusion. You don't get as much writing process on the internet as you do. Like you can watch people's artistic process videos, and then you can watch someone, a time-lapse YouTube video and be like, oh, that's what they did. They started with the background and then they did the foreground, or they did the foreground and they were done with most of it. And then they just cropped and selected a bunch of it and plonked it somewhere else. There's no rules for how you do a thing.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people get caught up on thinking that they're going to do, that their process might be completely wrong, or that they have to do things a certain way. They have to own the correct tools. There's only one set of tools. There's only one. Literally, like when I was learning guitar when I was younger, so many people are like, what's the guitar that you get? Which actually matters a lot less than how much you practice and how good you are. And you give a really good guitarist a bad guitar, they're still going to sound good. But there's so much that we talked about gatekeeping. That was it. Gatekeeping creativity, and how I think this is what stops so many people is they think that something has to be done a certain way, and something does or doesn't make you a valid writer or a musician or screenwriter or actor. And actors can be so interesting. There's so many actors out there when you talk to them about what they do, and they're like, I don't know what I'm doing, man. I cheat, or this was just a good take, or like, no, I haven't studied this method. They're just doing their own thing because it's such a personal craft. And then they're just really good at it because they've done it a lot. They just practiced, but they still found their own weird way into things. But gosh, I wish we taught people this so much more. I wish we said, it's like people are gatekeeping themselves, feeling that they can't do something. And if I wanted to, pass anything on to other people, it would be like, just start doing the thing. And it's not going to be great when you start it anyway, but that's okay. You're going to learn so much more by doing it than by asking other people how they do their stuff. Just learn how to do it yourself, and you'll gradually work a lot of things out, and you'll tend towards other people's methods and tools, but you'll do that in your own personal way, which will help make you the musician or writer or painter or whatever that you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
So I wish we all talked about this much more.
Yeah. I think this is going to sound cheesy, but I think craftsmanship is found in the curiosity. To your point, if you want to become a better cook, The craftsmanship is found in the curiosity of what if I add a little bit more garlic, or what if I add maybe this vegetable that, you know, I wouldn't have thought of putting into this recipe. And maybe it's great, maybe it's shit, but you're going to learn from that. Me clinking the two glasses, I was like, I may use this, I may not, but I learned how to process those sounds that I, oddly enough, like I haven't really worked with glass very much, from like a raw standpoint, like recording it, processing it, mixing it, etc.
God, you're right though, and that loops us back to the curiosity thing. Yeah.
I really think craftsmanship is found in the curiosity, and that, yeah, to your point, I forget exactly how we got to that topic when we caught up over the weekend, but we spoke about, like, in order to learn how to make films, you don't need the, you know, $20,000 camera. You just need what you have available to you. And then the natural next step, when it feels right, will be potentially to upgrade, you know, that gear. But creating is so much more than the gear that one has in front of them. And admittedly, audio is a very expensive field to get into, in general, but so much can be done on a budget as well.
I remember, I think with, you know, two bands I listened to growing up, I think it was both Queen and Metallica had stories about just like recording stuff on like tape, on like just a tape cassette recorder, or getting like a really basic, I don't know if 4 tracks existed, maybe 8 tracks, but like, you know, the mixes are not great, but the point was to record things down, to practice a little bit with some mixing and demo levels. And then like, it doesn't sound amazing, but if you have a recording of like, if your band is quite good at playing together, a bad recording of that still sounds like palatable to somebody, and somebody can listen to that and be like, oh, this is a cool tune, or like, maybe this isn't wonderfully produced and this isn't the quality you want to be at, but people spot the talent. It's same for like, I know this is a bad analogy, but like if you had terrible handwriting and wrote a good story, people would struggle to read it, but they would like, they'd still connect with a character or a plot idea, and they'd still be excited about that. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think that's a really good way of describing it. And I think we kind of owe it to demystify a lot of creative stuff to people all the time, because a lot of artistic creative stuff is about circling all the way back to what you said at the start, just kind of applying yourself, and you don't wait for inspiration. You sort of chase it, or you make it happen every day. Some days go better than others, but you're always being in a place where you're regular, you're consistent, you're showing up to try and do something, even if it's just a couple of hours a day. And we're all going to get better at doing something if we're able to put the time and the energy. You've just reminded me of the comics writer Alan Moore did some interview in the 80s or 90s. And I keep thinking about this a lot lately, but it was on British TV, or it was not an interview, it was a show about him, but he talked about growing up working class, and being lucky enough to get into comics by a lot of like working class people didn't get into creative things. And it's still a consistent, I consider myself to kind of straddle that background, and it's still a consistent thing. It's so much easier to get into certain creative stuff if you have a more stable background and more funding. But he said something like, there's probably a bunch of people I went to school with who would also be good writers if they'd had the chance to apply the time.
Yeah.
And he said something like, I just feel like I was really lucky, or it was really unfair, because like all these other people at school with me were clever and were passionate and were interested, and they had good ideas. It didn't work out. There's also, I watched a Simon Pegg interview a while ago where he talked about Nick Frost, his co-star, and a lot of things that he's in, being really funny, but not being very good at stand-up, but just being funny in different contexts when they would do things together, and they just needed to put him in the right context. And everyone had great chemistry, but he didn't think he was funny because he tried to do stand-up and it hadn't worked. And it was that opportunity of like, no, if we film stuff or bounce off each other, that's really funny. If we try and write these things and iterate on them. A lot of it is, I think a lot of people have an opportunity to do amazing things and they talk themselves out of it.
Yeah, you touched on a lot there. I think yeah, if one has the time, which I guess that's nuanced as well, because we live under the weight of capitalism. Like, people need to have enough to,
Yeah.
pay rent and
Yeah.
food and shelter, safety, heat. And yeah, to your point, like it is a privilege to have the time to also work on one's craft.
And
We
who's less likely to have the time? It's
That's
going to
it.
be the less privileged people. It's
That's
the
it.
minority people.
That's
It's
it.
what opportunities are we giving to anyone who isn't a white dude who's going to be at the top of that pyramid of time and privilege, honestly, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. I would love to one day, like, I wonder how one can foster, I don't know, the next generation of artists. And I think about this a fair bit of, like, there's tools, for example, that I use where I'm like, I don't need this license anymore. Am I able to take the license off my computer and offer it to someone who might need it? And I've been thinking about that a lot because, like, it is, again, it's quite expensive getting into audio, or can be. Like, there are ways to, I found those ways of like, oh, how does one buy something secondhand, or what is like the microphone that we're going to get that I'm going to use for years and years and years to come, so that I'm not like repurchasing things, etc. But yeah.
I feel like it's a good question to ask, and it's hard because you're pushing against the flow of things, whatever you do. I've been lucky enough that I've done some lectures and talks over the years, some like guest talks, guest lectures. I did a few for universities in London that would have a focus on like working class or lower income people, and I was like, yep, I'm in on that. I want to lecture at this place. I want to do a lecture at Ravensbourne University or something like this. When the guy reaches out and said, like, a lot of our student base is working class and like Black or Asian Londoners and people who maybe they couldn't get into or couldn't afford other programs, I'm like, yeah, that's where I'm going to do my thing, where I'd rather do that. I used to do a couple of panels on in the old days before the pandemic, a couple of GDC panels about tabletop, and I tried to squeeze more diverse people onto those panels, and that was honestly that felt like really pushing hard against the current, because as soon as you open up applications, a bunch of white guys are in your DMs being like, I'm available, I'll be there, I can do that. And you're reaching out to other people and they're like, I can't afford to go, I can't do that. I think we all find different ways to be like, oh, there's a way that I could give back. But I think as soon as we start trying to do that, one thing I've noticed is actually it's not easy, because you end up pushing against so many conventions, and so many things that would be much easier to execute if you didn't shake stuff up. And that gives you, I mean, as a guy, it gives you an insight to what it's like for a lot of other people operating all the time anyway, when they're already pushing against those conventions every day and feeling that resistance. Because I'm still doing it on, pretty easy mode.
GDC is a great example of something that's inaccessible to, like, it is so expensive to get a ticket. San Francisco is so expensive, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, like we could have a whole episode about this.
We could. It's just existing in it, going there to do stuff is difficult, and that's even outside of the whatever travel visa things you may need access to go to the United States. But it's an expensive place to get to and to be in. Yeah. And I do appreciate over the years more and more discussion about that. Josh Sawyer, the designer, I think when he won something a couple of years back, he just got on stage and was like, this event is really expensive for a lot of people to get to. And at the start of one of the awards this year, was it Sean Pierre, I think is his name, immediately opened by saying, think about people who aren't here. Think about minority creators, trans, queer people, people of color who couldn't afford this, but are also doing valid work. And they had numerous speakers throughout that awards thing, presenters who are like, let's think more and more about the people who also aren't here, who matter just as much. And I really appreciated them doing that, because having that time and that platform to speak like that and put those messages out is good, because again, you're pushing against the tide, and very quickly the tide comes back, other stuff happens. People, unless you keep pushing, people forget, or you don't get that change. It never comes quickly. It has to come through repeatedly being difficult.
Yeah, I didn't even realize that. I mean, I did not go to GDC this year. Yeah, I didn't realize that those conversations were happening, and that's awesome. Hell yeah, and we should be having those conversations more.
I appreciate that a lot. Yeah, I watched some of the award stuff live, and some of the things that the presenters said were on point.
I gotta watch replays. I will say one thing about GDC. GDC had a virtual event back last September that I really enjoyed. It was called GDC Showcase, and it was really, really well done. Maybe we ended on this note, and I'll keep this in the VOD. It was, shoot, I forget the platform that they used, but you create your own little pixel avatar, and in either the structured networking or the open networking, it's like a game. So you're like moving your avatar around in this kind of virtual convention hall, and when you get close enough to someone, either it automatically turns on your camera and microphone depending on the permissions that you give it. But it was actually such a great way to meet other devs, and I feel like not a lot of people spoke about the event, and I was trying to talk about it and get people to sign up, but that is so much more accessible than paying thousands and thousands of dollars to go in person. Yes. And I'm not saying that it is not a one-on-one by any means, but it is nice that it exists. I hope that events like that can happen more often, because we have the technology now to facilitate that, the serendipitous bumping into someone, and then who knows, maybe working with that person 2 years from that point. But it was, I wish that there was more of that, again, for the accessibility.
I love that idea. I wish I'd tried that. I didn't try that. I think I had something else happening at the time, but I can also see myself participating that and immediately trying to make it more difficult by telling someone like, oh, I'm here in this place, come and meet me. And then trying to, I don't know, move one pixel away from them as they chase me around, and then see if I can get them to accidentally meet somebody else instead.
Yeah, I love that. No, and it was well done. Like, for a virtual event, it was really cool to be able to have it be within a video game.
Yeah, that's thematically appropriate.
Yeah, agreed. I was gonna say, I didn't ask you. Maybe we wrap it up here and we open up chat. What video game are you playing right now?
What a great question. I'm playing a couple of different things. Let's say 3 things right now. And I'm about to start a 4th. So I think or 5. Oh no. So I think I might be playing Mouthwashing next week. And I might actually stream that on the internet, on popular internet website Twitch.
We'll have your socials in the comments, in the description.
Same for 1000X Resist, which I've had for a little while, because Remy is local, and he gave me a key, and he also gave me some really cool tips. He shared some really helpful knowledge with me. That's also up for, I think, the Nebula. That's been up for a few awards, and people have really praised the narrative, so I'm very excited to play that. But I'm not playing it yet, and that's one of those things where I'm like, I think I'm going to be interested in this, so I'm like taking a breath and building up to it. But I've heard so much praise from different people about different things in the game, which is really exciting. So those are kind of imminently to be played. But I've currently also been playing River Towns, which is nothing like that.
I haven't heard of it.
It's Tetris city building. So if you imagine dropping districts of a city, Tetris style, but like, there are certain rules where it's like, hey, these districts, you'll get more points if you connect them up. So if you can put this color next to this color, if you can put things the other side of a river and like build a bridge, that might give you a couple of bonus points. And then they start throwing in game mechanics, which is like, if you can surround this other object with these shapes, you'll get extra points. Or if you can drop this shape on top of this other shape, it'll give you a bonus, and then open up another bonus tile that you can drop things on. So don't drop things there yet. You want to drop things there later. So And I'm not actually super into puzzle things, but I just keep playing this, and it is very well executed. I think it's got great presentation, and I will play it, and like 45 minutes have gone by, and I'm like, oh, that was fun. I just want to try that level again and see if I can get a couple more points. And it's not the type of game that you would think I would like, or that I would, because I love a lot of narrative stuff and often RPG or strategy stuff, or roguelikes, and I guess it's roguelike-ish. But on the roguelike thing, I've been playing Sulphur, which is a first-person shooter where it procedurally generates levels full of either like goblins or weird dudes with guns, or caves or forests. And I swear it's mostly some Swedish guys who are like, we want to put lots of guns in a game and you can mod all the guns. What are we going to do? I guess you shoot goblins or you run around level, because it's full of, I collected like 20 guns and there's still more. And they get more and more obscure, and they have weird action and weird ways they behave and weird ways you can mod them. And then it's like, what if like a goblin with a spear was running at you and couldn't possibly defend itself, and you're like, oh, I shoot the goblin with a gun. And you're like, okay, so as time goes on, we'll just, now on this level there's 20 of them, so it's panic, because one goblin with a spear doesn't bother you with a gun, but like 20 goblins, or one of them like firing fireballs at you and one of them shooting you with a longbow, and then something dropping on you, it's like, oh, now this is how this gets hard.
That sounds very difficult.
That's been fun. And the other one is, I've got it literally open in a browser right now. It's called Dragon Sweeper, and it's Minesweeper, but all the tiles that you click on have a value, and if you have more hit points than the tile, you clear the tile. So you click on, sometimes you find an open space, mostly it's like a level 1 or a level 2, level 3 monster, and as you clear those tiles, you get more experience, which allows you to clear larger number tiles.
Oh, that makes sense. That's cool. That's a cool little remix on Minecraft.
It's really clever. I think it was a game jam thing from the global game jam, and probably at this point hundreds of thousands of people might have played it, because I've seen it talked about a lot. But Dragon Sweeper. So all of those, which are all kind of different, and they probably will inspire me in different ways.
I love that. I see some support for 1,000 Times Resist in chat. That game is so good. I don't want to spoil anything for you, but I speed ran the shit out of it because I had to know what happens next. It was brilliant. Just absolutely brilliant in every way. Which I feel like I played 4 games recently that are all kind of in the same, that people talk about in the same breath. So like 1,000 Times Resist, Loreline, The Laser Eyes, Signalis, and Pacific Drive in that order. All brilliant. Would recommend all of them. I'm playing Fields of Mystria, which is in alpha, which I am loving. It's just, and I've never played Stardew Valley, but I was like, I need something really chill. And it's so nice and it's so chill. And I already have an embarrassing amount of hours in that game, even though I got it a few days ago. Really good. And then I'm eternally playing Final Fantasy XIV, which is an MMO. So they have me for the rest of time.
Is Palia chill?
I don't know about Palia, but I'm playing Mystria.
Oh, sorry, Mystria.
It's pretty chill. I don't know. We'll see. Is it not chill? I don't know. It's chill right now, but I'm still at the beginning.
My Stardew experience, and this is my own fault, it's just like you get a farm and then it's like, oh, well, but now you need a coop and now you need a barn. And now there's
I have a vegan farm. See, this is it. No vegan. Well, I'm vegan. So I'm like, I have a vegan farm. I just have corn and watermelon and potatoes.
Stardew was like, you need all these things, or sometimes they give you a free thing. They're like, oh, here's a free recycling machine because you unlock something, or here's a free furnace. And it's like, well, now I need to be smelting iron and recycling stuff that I found, and now I need to be fishing, and there isn't enough time, and I got to get the cows out and feed the cows, but then I got to put the cows back in again, and now I got to water my crops, and it's like 3 p.m. and I'm supposed to go into town and like talk to somebody in town about something. And then they'll be like, are you coming to this event? And you're like, are you kidding? What? which is, very anti-chill.
That sounds very stressful. Mystria has been very
Mhm.
chill so far. Big fan, and it's only an alpha, which it feels like it's way farther down the line. But yeah, big fan.
Yeah, a lot of people are playing. Yeah, sorry, I mixed that up with Paleo because that's also there's been such a growth of this over sort of the last almost decade now of people who want to, basically live this farm adjacent life
Mm.
to some degree, even if it's what's the Pokemon and Guns game?
Oh, Pal World.
Yeah. So, it's like get some animals, build some stuff. It's Stardew related, but also kind of Minecraft related. And I love it because I love that kind of genre straddling thing. But I don't know. They can be wonderfully chill. I guess it's just maybe how I play. Like Minecraft can arguably be chill, but also
I've
it's
never
like
played
I
it.
built a castle, I love it, and a bit of it's on fire. So my world is panic.
Yeah, that's fair. I suppose it is about how we choose to play.
Yeah, that says a lot about me.
Paul, this was so lovely.
Thank you.
Just for the VOD, we'll open up chat in a moment, but just for the VOD, if you're here and watching the VOD, thank you so much for watching. If you have feedback or thoughts on what else you'd like to see on the show, please let us know. Again, we will have Paul and I's. We will have our socials in the description. Paul will put your Twitch channel there as well.
Thank you.
Or whatever you would like to be down there. But thank you so much for watching.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. And we'll open up chat for a little bit. I have a meeting in like 25 minutes, but
okay. Thanks for letting me ramble so much.
This was so lovely. Thank you so much. This is great.
Okay.
I feel like this was like a nice little life chat right at the beginning of the day.